Hey everyone, how are you doing tonight? This evening we re-stepping back into one of the most chaotic and defining moments of the 20th century, World War II. When we picture that era, our minds instantly fill with tanks grinding through mud, soldiers storming beaches, and planes screaming overhead. We think of bravery, loss, strategy, and sacrifice, but how often do we stop to ask a far humbler question? What did these soldiers actually eat? Behind every charge into enemy fire, behind every sleepless night in a foxhole, there was a simple, unglamorous challenge feeding millions of men scattered across continents. Armies weren't just fighting battles against enemies, they were waging daily wars against hunger, fatigue, and the despair that came from opening yet another tin of mystery meat. A soldier might have been brave enough to face machine guns, but could he face another spoonful of powdered eggs without breaking? Feeding the front lines was not just about survival, it was about morale. A hot meal could bring hope when none remained, while a cold, greasy ration could crush a man's spirit faster than enemy shellfire. Nations poured science, tradition, and desperation into their rations. Americans engineered neat little boxes of calories, Germans began with bread and sausage only to sink into erzots. Substitutes. The British clung to tea as if it were the lifeblood of empire. Soviets marched on cabbage and black bread, and Japanese soldiers often fought on little more than rice and willpower. Tonight we're not talking about generals and maps or borders redrawn in blood. We're talking about food, or at least what passed for food in wartime. Spam and biscuits, cabbage and rice balls, tins of corned beef and chocolate bars that could double as bricks. Because if there is one thing every soldier had in common, it's that they all had to eat even when the food seemed determined to fight back. So let us imagine this together. You an American soldier in 1944. You've been marching for miles. Your boots are soaked through with mud. Your body aches from carrying your gear, and every step feels heavier than the last. You've heard gunfire crack above your head. You've seen men fall beside you. And now, in a rare moment of pause, your stomach growls so loud it almost drowns out the memory of battle. You reach into your pack, hoping for something comforting, maybe even familiar. What you pull out isn't a home-cooked meal. It isn't even food in the sense you once knew it. It's the Ration, a small, square cardboard box that might look unassuming, but inside lies the US Army's attempt to keep you alive, one brick-sized meal at a time. The Ration came in 3 separate boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each one neatly packed, scientifically designed, and roughly the size of your fist. Open the breakfast box and you'd find a can of ham and eggs. Though to call it either was generous, the texture fell somewhere between damp cardboard and drywall. Alongside it came crackers hard enough to break teeth, instant coffee that tasted like rust, and powdered lemonade that made you wonder if someone in the War Department had a personal grudge against you. And, tucked inside every box, a single sheet of toilet paper. Just one. Enough to make you laugh or cry depending on how your morning was going. Lunch wasn't much kinder. Cheese spread more chemical than dairy, another stack of jaw-breaking biscuits, and a chocolate bar so dense it could double as a weapon. With no spoon, soldiers improvised using bayonets, sticks, or sheer frustration to dig it out. Dinner brought canned meat and beans that often resembled something dug out of a crime scene, with more crackers and the occasional fruit bar that tasted faintly of apple, if you had imagination. But here's the strange thing. Despite their miserable flavor, these rations were nutritional wonders for their time. Around 3,000 calories per day, packed with protein, fat, and sugar enough to keep soldiers marching, fighting, and enduring. Troops swapped items like prisoners, trading contraband, cigarettes for chocolate, cheese for crackers, anything to dodge the dreaded ham and egg can. And yet, buried inside the misery, there were moments of joy. Every once in a while, tucked inside a Ration, you'd find a real Hershey bar. One bite of smooth, familiar chocolate, and suddenly you weren't crouched in the mud anymore. You were home, if only for a heartbeat. And then there was the infamous Ration Barra, so-called chocolate bar that was less dessert and more survival weapon. It was designed to look like chocolate, wrapped like chocolate, and handed to soldiers as if it were a sweet treat. But the resemblance stopped there. Built to withstand tropical heat, Arctic cold, and months in a backpack, the D-Ration was deliberately made to be unappetizing. It was dense, bitter, and so hard you could chip a tooth trying to bite it. Some men grated it into hot water, others tried softening it over a fire, but many swore it was better suited for hammering tent stakes than eating. Still, when food ran out, when supply lines broke, and when hope was scarce, that little brown brick meant survival. 600 calories of sheer endurance packed into something that tasted like despair. Soldiers hated it, but they carried it all the same. Because in war, you don't always eat for pleasure, you eat to live. And sometimes, that was enough. Now picture this: you've been in the field for days. Rain has soaked your uniform until it clings to your skin. Mud cakes your boots, and your rifle feels heavier with every mile. You've slept in ditches, in barns, sometimes not at all. Then word comes down the line: the field kitchen has arrived. For a soldier, those words were as sweet as any victory. The field kitchen was, in many ways, the army's traveling heart. It was glamorous, often just a large wagon or truck fitted with kettles and burners. But to the men, it was salvation on wheels. Here, food wasn't just calories sealed in cardboard. It was hot, steaming, and sometimes even tasted like a meal. Soldiers would line up with their mess kits, clutching them like treasure, waiting for ladles of stew, watery soup, or, if luck was kind, thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. Meals from the field kitchen were rarely elegant. Soups were thin, meat was often tough, and vegetables were more rumor than reality. But compared to the eternal cycle of tins and rations, it was a feast. A spoonful of something hot could thaw frozen fingers, lift a weary head, and for a few minutes make men feel human again. Around the steaming kettles, jokes resurfaced, songs were sung, and the battlefield felt just a little further away. There was also ritual in the act. Soldiers scraped their kits clean, not daring to waste a drop. Some tucked away crusts of bread for later, hidden in their packs. Others traded portions, a kind of battlefield marketplace where friendships were cemented over an extra ladle of stew. And on rare occasions, when supplies allowed, cooks got creative, tossing in spices, or mixing in captured ingredients from local farms. Those were the nights when food didn't just fill bellies, it created memories. The field kitchen proved a simple truth. In war, food was never just about sustenance. It was about morale, about binding men together in the face of horror, about reminding them that beyond the mud and blood, there was still warmth to be found. A tin plate of stew might not win battles on its own, but it kept soldiers standing long enough to fight them, and sometimes, that was victory enough. If the American soldier's story was one of cardboard boxes and Calera-counted bars, the German soldier's story began in a far more familiar place: bread and sausage. For centuries, those two staples had been the backbone of German diets, and when the Wehrmacht marched across Europe, it carried that tradition with it. At the start of the war, rations for German troops could almost look enviable: dense rye bread, smoked sausages, slabs of cheese, tins of meat, and sometimes even butter or jam. Soldiers prided themselves on hearty, filling meals that carried the taste of home onto foreign soil. But as the war dragged on, and the demands of feeding millions stretched resources to breaking, that picture of abundance began to crumble. By 1942, the glory of sausage and cheese was giving way to ersatz substitutes that looked like food but rarely tasted like it. Bread, once dark and rich, was cut with fillers like sawdust, potato starch, or ground-up weeds. Coffee became a bitter brew of roasted acorns and barley. Meat rations shrank to thin slices or vanished altogether, replaced with grayish spreads that smelled faintly of glue. On the Eastern Front, misery was multiplied. Supply lines froze along with the men, and food spoiled before it reached the trenches. Soldiers boiled horse meat when lucky enough to find it, or scavenged whatever they could from ruined villages. Ersatz margarine spread on ersatz bread was a cruel joke. Calories, yes, but no comfort. Hunger gnawed at discipline, morale, and strength, eating away at the army as surely as Soviet bullets and winter frost. And yet, even here, the ritual of food mattered. German soldiers held on fiercely to mealtime, to that scrap of bread or that thin soup ladled out in the snow. Sharing rations became an act of camaraderie, a bond that kept men together when everything else was falling apart. A crust of rye bread divided between two was more than food, it was solidarity, survival, and a reminder that they were still human in a world that often seemed determined to strip that away. By the war's end, the story of German rations had become a mirror of the Reich itself. Once proud, efficient, and full of promise, now reduced to scraps, substitutions, and bitter endurance. Ersatz food was not just nourishment, it was the taste of decline. If there was ever a place where food or the lack of it decided the fate of men and empires, it was the Eastern Front. Here, in the endless plains of Russia, hunger was as merciless an enemy as bullets or bombs. Winter didn't simply arrive, it descended like a crushing weight. Snow buried the land, wind sliced through wool and leather, and rivers froze into unyielding walls of ice. Soldiers marched, fought, and bled in temperatures so low that metal could burn bare skin, and the question of food was no longer one of taste but of survival itself. For German soldiers, rations that had already grown meager became almost useless in the Russian cold. Ersatz bread froze into bricks, nearly impossible to bite. Sausage stiffened like wood. Canned goods solidified into icy lumps that had to be thawed with body heat, or over meager fires that barely lasted against the wind. Men gnawed at frozen potatoes as if they were stones. Hunger hollowed their faces, dulled their eyes, and slowed their movements until fatigue became as lethal as enemy fire. The Soviets, though fighting on their own soil, fared little better. Supply trains struggled to reach the front, and even when they did, soldiers often received little more than black bread, cabbage soup, and weak tea. Meat was a rarity, sugar almost mythical. On the worst days, soldiers boiled leather belts, tree bark, or weeds pulled from frozen ground. Hunger blurred into madness. Men dreamed of meals they would never eat again, reciting recipes like prayers, clinging to memory as much as to life. In cities like Leningrad, under siege for months, starvation reached apocalyptic levels. Civilians and soldiers alike fought not just the invader, but the absence of food itself. Corpses littered the streets, and every scrap animal plant, even wallpaper paste, was consumed in the desperate attempt to survive one more day. And yet, in this frozen hell, food retained its power as hope. A single hot bowl of thin soup could bring men back from despair, if only for a moment. Sharing a crust of bread with a comrade was an act of defiance against the cold and the war, both. The Eastern Front was not just a battlefield of tanks and rifles, it was a battlefield of hunger, where every bite meant another hour of life, another chance to see the dawn. In the snow, armies learned a brutal truth. You can fight without sleep, you can march without shoes, but without food, even the strongest soldier becomes a shadow. If hunger was the constant drumbeat of the Eastern Front, the Soviet soldier knew its rhythm best. The Red Army fought not just with rifles and tanks, but with empty stomachs and an iron will. Their rations were simple, repetitive, and often inadequate, but they reflected a culture that had been hardened by hardship long before the first German tank rolled across the border. A typical Soviet ration might include a piece of dense black bread, a ladle of watery cabbage soup, and perhaps a spoonful of kosher-boiled grains that clung together in lumps. On better days, there might be a slice of salted fish or a cube of pork fat, the prized sallow that soldiers treasured as both food and fuel against the cold. Sugar, when it appeared, was hoarded like treasure. Tobacco, traded as eagerly as gold. Yet, despite the monotony, these meals carried a kind of grim efficiency. Black bread was heavy and filling, cabbage stored well through the winter, and kasha could be cooked in massive cauldrons that fed entire units at once. It was food designed not for pleasure but for endurance fuel for the relentless grind of war. What kept the Soviet soldier moving was not the taste of the meal, but the meaning behind it. Each crust of bread was a reminder of home, of family, of the collective struggle against an invader who threatened to erase everything familiar. Sharing food in the Red Army wasn't optional, it was survival, solidarity, and defiance rolled into one. A soldier might split his last crust with a comrade, not because he could spare it, but because fighting hungry together was better than fighting alone. There were moments of bitter irony too. Captured German supply depots sometimes revealed sausages, butter, and chocolate luxuries beyond imagination for most Red Army troops. For a brief, almost surreal moment, Soviet soldiers would feast like kings on their enemy's food, before returning to the reality of cabbage and bread. And yet, perhaps because of this constant deprivation, the Soviet soldier developed a resilience that shocked the world. They learned to endure hunger, to fight on meager fuel, and to see food not as comfort, but as a weapon of survival. Where others might have broken, they kept marching. Where others faltered, they endured. In the end, the Soviet soldier's greatest meal was victory itself, and for that, they were willing to march on black bread and cabbage soup as long as it took. War doesn't wait for dinner time. On the front lines, soldiers learned quickly that food wasn't always served in neat boxes or steaming pots. More often than not, it arrived frozen solid, half-rotten, or in tins that refused to open, and so men from every army became reluctant chefs, improvising with whatever tools, fire, or imagination they had. Bayonets, designed for stabbing, often doubled as can openers or skewers. Soldiers speared chunks of meat or bread and held them over tiny flames, savoring the illusion of a proper meal even when the result was little more than charred crumbs. Helmets, stripped from their usual purpose, were turned into makeshift cooking pots. filled with snow to melt into water, or soup brewed from scraps. A bit of bacon grease could transform boiled potatoes into something resembling comfort. And coffee brewed in a dented tin mug could feel like a miracle after days of mud and exhaustion. On the Eastern Front, where supplies were scarce, soldiers roasted whatever they could find: turnips pulled from frozen fields, horse meat from fallen mounts, even stray dogs when desperation overcame taboo. In the Pacific, American G's improvised stoves out of empty fuel cans, heating spam until it sizzled, mixing it with rice, or frying biscuits to make them edible. British troops boiled tea in almost anything that could hold water, insisting that a hot cup, however smoky or bitter, was worth the effort, even in the middle of shellfire. Improvisation wasn't just about filling the stomach, it was about fighting despair. A soldier who could coax flavor from the barest scraps was a hero to his comrades. Food became a shared act of resilience. Passing around a spoonful of jam, dividing a single onion into a stew, trading salt for sugar, or seasoning bland rations with whatever herbs could be scavenged from the countryside. These small victories against monotony kept morale alive. And then there were the tricks passed down like folklore: grating the dreaded American D-bar into boiling water for a bitter hot chocolate, frying hardtack crackers in grease until they softened into something edible, diluting soup with extra water so every man in the squad could at least say he'd had a bowl. In these moments, survival wasn't just about food, it was about creativity, camaraderie, and the stubborn refusal to let war steal the taste of life completely. Improvised meals might have been strange, smoky, or barely edible, but in the chaos of battle, they were proof that soldiers were more than cogs in a war machine. They were human beings, hungry, resourceful, and determined to carve moments of normalcy out of the madness. If there was one thing the British soldier carried into battle besides his rifle, it was tea. More than just a drink, it was a lifeline, a ritual, and a reminder that no matter how dark the skies or how muddy the trenches, a proper cup could steady the soul. Tea was more than fuel, it was identity. The British Army's rations were practical, if uninspired. Hard biscuits, tinned meat, powdered milk, and the occasional sweet jam formed the backbone of meals. The biscuits, rock hard and flavorless, were infamous for breaking teeth if eaten dry. But softened in tea, they became edible, even comforting. Cans of corned beef, nicknamed bully beef, appeared in nearly every meal. Greasy, salty, and monotonous. It wasn't loved, but it filled the belly. And still, none of it mattered so much as the tea. Wherever British troops went, from the deserts of North Africa to the fields of France, they carried kettles, stoves, and sometimes just battered mess tins to boil water. In lulls between battles, men would huddle around fires, stirring sugar into steaming mugs, chatting quietly, and for a fleeting moment feeling almost at home. Commanders understood its value too. Hot tea was issued during air raids in London, in forward trenches, even before dangerous night patrols. A strong cup could calm nerves as surely as a bullet could take a life. There was a kind of stoic humor in how the British handled their food. Soldiers joked about rations with the same dry wit that defined their outlook on the war. "If we don't beat the Germans," one quip went, "we'll bore them to death with bully beef." Yet beneath the jokes was a deep endurance. The British soldier knew his meals weren't feasts, but he also knew that a biscuit dunked in tea and shared with a mate could mean more than a lavish banquet. What stands out most is not the food itself, but the attitude. British soldiers accepted monotony with a shrug, endured shortages with humor, and clung to tea as a sacred constant. Even in prisoner of war camps, captured British troops bartered fiercely for tea leaves, sometimes trading away bread or cigarettes just to brew a single pot. It wasn't about taste, it was about survival of the spirit. In the end, the British soldier's diet was plain, sometimes miserable, but always accompanied by that steaming mug. And in those long nights of bombing, marching, and waiting, it was tea, humble, hot, and familiar, that kept a sense of civilization alive in a world unraveling. For Japanese soldiers in World War II, food was not just sustenance, it was discipline, identity, and, too often, tragedy. At the heart of their rations lay a single grain: rice. To the Japanese, rice was more than a staple, it was sacred, a symbol of life itself. Every soldier carried it in some form, boiled when possible, or hardened into portable rice balls. Alongside it came dried fish, pickled vegetables, or miso paste when supplies allowed. Simple, modest, and unmistakably Japanese. But as the war dragged on, and Japan's empire stretched thin across Asia and the Pacific, rice grew scarce. Supply lines faltered, ships were sunk, and rations shrank. Soldiers often found themselves living on half rations, then quarter rations, until bowls of steaming rice were replaced by millet, barley, or whatever could be scrounged from occupied lands. Some units were reduced to eating grass, roots, or whatever scraps of food could be found in the jungle. Malnutrition set in, weakening bodies already battered by disease and combat. Yet discipline held firm. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hunger without complaint. Officers drilled into them that suffering was part of their duty, that the empire demanded sacrifice. Starving men still saluted sharply, still marched, still fought with what strength they had left. To give in to hunger was to fail in spirit, and failure was unthinkable. This endurance came at a terrible cost. Countless Japanese soldiers did not die from bullets or bombs, but from slow starvation, wasting away in distant jungles and islands cut off from resupply. In some desperate situations, rumors whispered of cannibalism, a dark shadow that clung to certain isolated garrisons. Survival became less about defeating the enemy and more about simply enduring the next day with a stomach that refused to be filled. And yet, even in these dire conditions, food remained a point of identity. Rice, however meager, linked soldiers back to home. A handful of grains boiled in a dented pot could evoke the memory of family dinners, of the warm kitchens of rural Japan, of life before war consumed everything. In this way, rice was more than fuel, it was memory, tradition, and the last fragile thread of normalcy. The story of Japanese rations is not one of comfort or variety. It is one of endurance and loss, where hunger became as much an enemy as any allied soldier. And in the jungles of the Pacific, many learned that in war, sometimes the cruelest battle was not against men with guns, but against an empty bowl. At first glance, the islands of the Pacific looked like paradise. Towering palms swayed in warm breezes, coconuts hung heavy overhead, and the forests teemed with birds, fruits, and wild plants. To a soldier fresh from the concrete and mud of Europe, it might have seemed like a dream, but to the men who fought there, American, Japanese, Australian, the jungle quickly revealed itself not as a lush paradise, but as a cruel and unrelenting trap. Food was the first betrayal. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles over open ocean, constantly harassed by enemy submarines and aircraft. For American Marines landing on small islands, rations often arrived late, spoiled in the heat, or were lost entirely when supply ships were sunk. Men were forced to subsist on whatever could be carried ashore: cans of Spam, powdered milk, chocolate bars melting into goo inside packs. Once those ran out, hunger gnawed quickly. The jungle seemed abundant, but appearances were deceiving. Many fruits were toxic, water sources teemed with parasites, and animals were scarce. Japanese soldiers, already accustomed to lean rations, tried to survive off coconuts, taro roots, and whatever plants they could find. But without proper variety, their bodies withered. Diseases like dysentery and malaria swept through both armies, stealing strength even faster than hunger. Heat and humidity turned even simple meals into ordeals. Crackers softened into mush, meat rotted within hours, and insects swarmed anything edible. Soldiers joked bitterly that they weren't fighting the enemy, they were fighting flies. In some campaigns, like Guadalcanal, men lost so much weight they looked like shadows of themselves, their uniforms hanging loose, their movements slowed by exhaustion. And yet, amidst the misery, men adapted. Americans learned to crack open coconuts for water, to catch crabs along the shoreline, to boil roots and leaves. Japanese soldiers, drilled in discipline, rationed every grain of rice, every scrap of dried fish, stretching food to its thinnest limits. Hunger became routine, a dull ache carried alongside rifles and bayonets. The Pacific jungle was beautiful, yes, but it was also pitiless. What looked like abundance was, in truth, a battlefield of survival. For soldiers stranded there, the war was not only fought against bullets and bombs, but against the land itself, land that refused to feed them, land that tested them with every sunrise. And in that green, endless prison, many learned the hardest truth of war. Paradise can kill just as surely as an enemy-s gun. When the guns finally fell silent and soldiers returned home, the war did not simply end, it lived on in memory, carried in scars, nightmares, and even in the simple act of eating. For many veterans, food was one of the most enduring reminders of their time in uniform. Some never touched certain foods again. American soldiers who had lived on powdered eggs and greasy tins swore off them for life, refusing even to look at canned meat in grocery stores. German veterans who had survived on ersatz bread so coarse it felt like sand between the teeth spoke with disgust whenever they saw cheap substitutes on their tables. And Japanese soldiers, who had starved in the jungles of the Pacific, carried a lifelong reverence for plain white rice, sometimes weeping at the sight of a full bowl placed before them in peacetime. But memory was not only bitter. For some, wartime rations became strange symbols of comfort. Veterans joked nostalgically about Spam, the canned meat that had sustained entire armies, and it later became a beloved food in parts of the world where American troops had passed through. British soldiers who had clung to tea as their anchor in the chaos carried that ritual home with them, drinking it not just as refreshment but as a quiet act of survival remembered. Food also shaped the stories veterans told their families. Around dinner tables decades later, men would describe the first hot meal after weeks of cold rations, the way a steaming plate of stew tasted like heaven after months of hard biscuits. Some told their children that what kept them going wasn't tea courage or duty alone, it was the thought of a warm kitchen waiting back home. Historians often write about battles, treaties, and leaders. But to the soldiers who lived it, the memory of war was sometimes as simple as a taste the bitterness of black bread, the chalky bite of a ration bar, the sweet relief of chocolate shared among friends in a foxhole. These flavors, both hated and cherished, became the language of memory. Food, in the end, was more than fuel in World War II. It was a constant companion, sometimes cruel, sometimes comforting, always unforgettable. And long after the uniforms were folded away and the medals tucked into drawers, the taste of war lingered on the tongue, a reminder that survival was not only about bullets and bravery, but also about what could be swallowed in the silence between battles. The year was 1791. The United States was still young, fragile, and uncertain of its place in the world. The revolution had ended, independence was won, but freedom came with bills to pay. The new federal government, led by George Washington and guided by Alexander Hamilton's economic vision, needed revenue to steady the nation's shaky finances, and so, Congress passed a tax on distilled spirits, the first federal tax on a domestic product. It seemed practical on paper. In reality, it lit a fuse. For frontier farmers, especially those in western Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline. Grain was bulky and difficult to transport over the rough Appalachian roads, but distilled into whiskey, it became compact, profitable, and even a kind of currency. A jug of whiskey could pay debts, buy supplies, or settle accounts with neighbors. Taxing it was not just inconvenient, it was seen as an attack on survival itself. Resistance flared quickly. Farmers refused to pay, courts were harassed, and tax collectors found themselves tarred, feathered, and driven from towns. The rebellion grew into a test of authority. Would the United States government enforce its laws, or would the frontier dictate its own rules? By 1794, the crisis reached its peak. Crowds of armed men gathered, violence spread, and whispers of full-scale insurrection began to drift eastward. George Washington, the war hero turned president, made his choice. Determined to prove that this new republic was not as weak as the Articles of Confederation had been, he personally led an army of nearly 13,000 men westward, the largest force he had ever commanded, even larger than some battles of the Revolution. When the rebels saw the sheer size of the force arrayed against them, their resistance collapsed. Bloodshed was minimal, and the rebellion dissolved into scattered arrests and pardons. The Whiskey Rebellion was, in many ways, less about alcohol and more about identity. It forced the young United States to answer a question that every nation must face. Who holds the ultimate power, the people in the fields, or the government in the capital? Washington's march made the answer clear. Federal law would stand, even against armed opposition. And yet, the story carries an irony. The rebellion that began over whiskey left behind no great battlefield, no glorious charge. Only the quiet lesson that taxation and governance are as much a part of freedom as independence itself. It was a reminder that liberty without structure can quickly unravel into chaos, and that even in a democracy, order sometimes must ride on horseback through restless valleys. Long before tanks rolled across Europe or soldiers opened ration tins, another kind of survival story was being written, not on battlefields, but in the laws that governed everyday life. Food and war test the body, but law tests the soul of a civilization. And when we look back at the earliest codes etched into stone or written on bamboo strips, one truth becomes clear. How a society treated its women reveals much about its values, its fears, and its vision of order. Take the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, carved into stone nearly 4,000 years ago. Its laws were blunt, sometimes brutal, but they offer a window into how women were seen and controlled. A wife's fidelity was guarded with harsh penalties, while her rights in marriage and divorce were tightly bound to property and inheritance. Women could own land, run businesses, and even act in court, but their freedom was always framed within a system designed to protect the authority of men. Justice, in Hammurabi's Babylon, was measured not by equality but by balance, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and women were woven into that order with both rights and restrictions. In ancient Greece, the situation looks different, but no less confining. Athenian women lived largely in the shadows of their homes, excluded from politics, denied the rights of citizenship, and bound to domestic spaces. Their world was the hearth and the loom, while men debated in the agora and voted in the assembly. Yet in Sparta, a strange contrast emerged. Women were granted more freedom, trained in physical fitness, and could inherit property. Spartan women shocked outsiders with their confidence and authority, their voices echoing loudly in a world where most women were silenced. Move eastward to China and we find another vast legal and cultural tapestry. Early Chinese codes, influenced by Confucian ideals, placed the family at the center of order. The three obediences became a lifelong chain: obedience to a father in youth, a husband in marriage, and a son in widowhood. Women were expected to embody virtue, silence, and sacrifice, their lives defined by service within the family structure. And yet, Chinese history is filled with women who bent or broke those rules: empresses, poets, philosophers, and rebels who carved space for themselves in a world that tried to confine them. Across these ancient worlds, law was more than parchment or stone, it was power. It dictated who could inherit land, who could testify, who could choose a spouse, and who could not. It defined the boundaries of freedom and the cost of stepping beyond them. And while men's names filled the records of kings, generals, and lawmakers, the daily reality of law was felt most deeply by women whose choices were shaped or erased by those rules. When we read these old codes today, they may seem distant, even alien, but the questions they raise are not so far removed from our own time. Who has the right to speak? Who has the right to decide? And how does law, that great invisible force, shape the lives of those whose voices are seldom heard? In Hammurabi's Babylon, in the city-states of Greece, in the dynasties of China, the answers were written in stone and ink. And though the centuries have passed, the struggle over law, power, and equality remains one of humanity's oldest and most enduring battles. When we trace these stories from soldiers breaking teeth on rations in the mud of Europe, to farmers rebelling over whiskey on the American frontier, to women bound by codes etched in stone thousands of years ago, we uncover more than isolated tales. We uncover the threads that weave humanity together. Food and law, as humble as they seem, are the quiet architects of our survival and our order. Food is the body's truth. It reveals our limits, our ingenuity, and our fragility. It can fuel courage or deepen despair, transform strangers into comrades, and turn memory into longing decades after the war has ended. To share bread in the snow or tea in the dark is to affirm life against the pull of nothingness. Law, by contrast, is the spirit's framework. It shapes what we owe one another, who holds power, who speaks, and who is silenced. It can protect or oppress, liberate or bind, but it always leaves its mark. To live under a law is to live within a story greater than one's own, a story that stretches across generations and empires. Taken together, food and law show us the essence of humanity, that we are creatures who endure not only by filling our stomachs, but by agreeing sometimes painfully on how to live together. Every soldier's ration and every line of code carved into stone whispers the same truth. Survival alone is not enough. We hunger also for meaning, for fairness, for belonging. And so, as we look back on these fragments of history, bread and whiskey, tea and rice, justice and rebellion, we are left with a question that lingers like the aftertaste of a bitter meal. If survival is the simplest human task, and justice the highest one, which do we truly value more when the world begins to break life at any cost, or life lived with dignity?